Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. In this video, what I want to do is talk about state. Like, where should your state exist? Now, I'm going to be talking about this in mainly React terms, but if you're using Svelte, if you're using SolidJS, if you're using Angular, if you're using Vue, you should still benefit from sort of thinking through sort of where data exists in your components in the way that I'm going to discuss it. Bottom line is, like, you may want to think about what you want to do is think about who needs the data. So, for example, first thing you should always do before you really build your app is kind of like sketch out all the components you plan on having, kind of like this. So I know, like, hey, our application always starts with an component, and then some components are rendered by that component, which render other components, which render other components. Now, if component G here needs a piece of data, and it's the only component that needs that piece of data, okay, so none of these other components really care what that piece of data is, it's meaningless to them, then that data should live in G. It's not needed anywhere, so that's the perfect place to put it. Okay, now let's pretend that the data is needed by C and G. Okay, well then it would make sense that C has the data, and then C can then pass the data down in React as props. You might have other mechanisms depending on your framework, but pass it down as props. Okay, so the data lives here. Here's where and then basically if it needs a change down here, it just passes down any functions to do so. Okay, because again, data in React is unidirectional, it goes in one direction. Now, what if C and D need the data? Well, they can't communicate with each other, okay, because siblings cannot communicate with each other in React. It gets a little bit more complicated in Angular, because you can do some interesting things in Angular. In Vue, that is for the most part true, if I remember correctly. And same thing in Svelte and I think SolidJS. Okay, so you could pass data up, so it's not unidirectional, pretty much anything but React. But you get the idea. Okay, so in that case, I need both of these components to be able to receive the data. So I'm going to house the data in A, because A can pass it down to C, and A can also pass it down to D. This is what's referred to as lifting state. I'm going to house the data in A, not because A needs the data, but because C and D need the data. And if I put it in C, D can't get it, and if I put it in D, C can't get it. But A can pass it down to both. Okay? Now, what if A and B both need it? Well, then I kind of have to put the data in an app, and then it passes it down from props from there. Now, what if I have something weird like this, like G and J need the data, but all these components in the middle don't need it? That would seem really tedious to have to house the data in an app, pass it down to B, pass it down to F, pass it down to J. From app, pass it down to A, pass it down to C, pass it down to G. Okay, this is what's referred to as props drilling. It can be really tedious. This is when you start thinking about things like context or other state management approaches like use reducer, state machines, Redux, MobX, all these kind of tools for managing state. Okay, because at that point you may have, but again, do I put everything in that store of data? Okay, no, I put just the things that wouldn't necessarily be needed here. Like if it's something that only exists in app, or it's something that might make more sense housing it in another component, I'll put it there. And once in a while, you might want to do is, like, if your component tree gets really, really big, you may want to create separate, like, sort of data centers, like a component that really is only purpose is to distribute state, to hold and distribute state, while all the other components just are stateless and just operate based on their props. So in this case, B and A may be stateful components because these components all share a similar state, so it's all housed in B. All these components receive it as props, but are stateless, meaning they don't have their own state. They operate based on the props passed in, which makes them more reusable. Okay, and same thing A. A really may have no visual, like may not really render much on the screen, other than rendering these components, but it warehouses, let's say, state and passes down the appropriate functions to the appropriate components that it's rendering. Okay, so you could do that too. You could think of different, like, sort of hubs of state throughout your your application. So that way you don't have all your state in one place in app. And the reason why that matters in React is because it does improve performance. Because if the state's located in app, then what's going to happen is that when you do that change of state, it's going to do a comparison of every component. It's going to basically the virtual DOM versus shadow DOM. I mean the actual DOM versus the virtual DOM. It does a comparison of every component and sees if there's any changes. If it notices a change, it then makes the update. But it'd be faster if the state change was in G. So if the state change is in G, only G is rebuilt. So only a comparison of G to the actual DOM is made. That's going to end up being more performant in the long run. So there is an art to sort of planning where your state exists. Okay, and there are things that can make it easier, again, like Redux, context, things like features like that. But be careful when you reach for those, because you don't want to fall into the trap of housing all your state somewhere because it's convenient. Because the end result will be that you also make less performance. But there are times where you have to kind of think about that trade-off. Like, hey, I don't want my state too scattered, and I don't want to be passing too many props, because that also will then make this less productive, because I'm having to go back and edit more files more regularly. Refactorings take more time, more prone to bugs. So, you kind of find that sweet balance. But the idea is, like, this is sort of the art of architecting your application, of thinking sort of like, what is state, what is stateless, meaning what has its sort of own data that determines how it behaves, versus what stateless, meaning it has no data internally, it just responds to its data it's getting from the outside. So yeah, hopefully you guys found that useful. My name is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. Have a great day and enjoy.